Thank you everyone for joining us for the fourth event in our ReGeneration Rising webinar series. This series is a companion to our ReGeneration Rising podcast, which is a collaboration between myself, Josie Warden, the head of regenerative design at the RSA, and Dr. Daniel Christian Wahl, author of Designing Regenerative Cultures. For the past 6 months, Josie, Daniel, and I have been exploring how regenerative practice is helping people collectively redesign their communities, cities, and economies, and create a thriving home for all on our planet. And we've been doing that with the help of guests like Paul Hawken, Kate Rayworth, Pamela Meng, and John Elkington, among others. This webinar series is an opportunity to dive deeper into some of the themes that we've been exploring in the podcast, and also to bring in new voices and perspectives. So those of you who have joined us for our previous events will know that we've already heard from the amazing Laura Storm, Tyson Younker-Porter, and Giles Hutchins. And today we're very fortunate to be joined by someone who has been a true inspiration to me, Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena is a pioneer of the new economy movement and a widely respected advocate for localization. She's the founder and director of Local Futures, an international not-for-profit organization dedicated to renewing ecological and social well-being by strengthening communities and local economies worldwide. Their flagship initiatives include the International Alliance for Localization and the hugely successful World Localization Day, where people from all over the world come together to explore the power of localization. Helena is the author of several books, including her seminal work, Ancient Futures, Learning from Ladakh, and she's also produced and co-directed the award-winning film, The Economics of Happiness. She's received numerous awards for her work on localization, including the Right Livelihood Award and the Goi Peace Prize. So welcome, Helena. I'll also introduce you to my co-host, Dr. Daniel Christian Wahl. Daniel works internationally as a consultant and educator in regenerative design, whole systems design, and transformative innovation. His vast catalogue of forward-thinking work, notably his book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, has inspired and enabled people from all walks of life to apply regenerative design to their own contexts. So welcome, Daniel, as well. And we're going to start with a bit of a discussion today, and then we're going to open up to the audience for questions. But I'm going to kick us off today by asking Helena, in your most recent book, you open with a statement, for our species to have a future, it must be local, which I think beautifully sums up the ethos of the localization movement. But for those of us who may be new to your work, can you explain what you mean by local futures and why we need to shift our systems towards localization?
Yes, the key is that we have lost sight of the living earth and the living people on whom we depend to meet our needs. So we're in this imprisoned system where we simply can't see the impact of what we do. I often talk about it as our arms having grown so long, we can't see what our hands are doing. So there's an absolute need for us to shape our cultures, our societies in such a way that we can get the feedback loops from the rest of life, with which we are intimately interdependent, of course, but also on which we depend. So it's an absolute need to move towards more localized economic systems. And we need to be very clear about the fact that, unfortunately, our governments are blindly locked into a belief about growth through global trade and through supporting a global financial casino. So there is an urgent need that those of us at the grassroots who are ecologically inclined, who care about justice, and who care about our own well-being and the well-being of our children, that we wake up to this picture.
You mentioned well-being there, and I know that one of your famous statements, and in fact it's the tagline for your organization, Local Futures, is the economics of happiness. I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, of course, my thinking on that was so informed by having had this amazing privilege of living with a people, with a culture that had not been in either enslaved or colonized even, or affected by the modern global consumer culture. So I arrived in this part of Tibet called Ladakh, the westernmost part of Tibet, in the mid-70s. The area had been sealed off for political reasons in the whole modern era. And in earlier periods of colonialism and so on, it was too remote to interest the colonizers. So the British sort of came through on the trade routes. But I was a linguist. I learned languages very quickly. I spoke 7 languages at that point, but they were all Indo-European. So it was quite a challenge to learn this ancient Tibetan dialect, which is related Sino-Tibetan. It's very difficult, but I was immediately so motivated because I fell in love with people who emanated the most amazing, not just a joie de vivre, but such equanimity, such clear inner peace, and just the humor, the laughter, the quick wit. So I fell in love with these people, and I had come out originally as part of a film team, but at first I stayed on to do a degree, or I was going to do a doctorate on the language. But after a few years, what became much more important was to try to work with the people to find another path to development. But so what so inspired me and what so opened my eyes, as I say, was this joy. And over the years, I came to understand much better where that came from and how it was possible. But after 2 years out there, I went back to my native country of Sweden, and that sharp contrast really clarified so many issues for me. I saw in Sweden, in Stockholm, more than half of all the dwellings inhabited by one person living alone, high-rise apartment, removed from the living world, removed from the plants, the animals, and very importantly, from others. So the sort of economics of happiness that we have been promoting is the economics of reconnection. It's a deep reconnection to others, very importantly, to human beings. It's getting skipped over a lot. Many of the indigenous leaders and many, now as we awaken to our love for nature and the need to protect nature, we're focusing very much on learning from nature herself. But I think we're not learning enough from what enabled indigenous cultures, in many cases, to thrive and prosper in environments all over the world. And this part of what it is to be human is that they were built, and I think without exception, on close intergenerational relationships. So the relationship between grandparents and great-grandparents and the grandchildren, great-grandchildren was so much more important than we realize today. And by the way, the Gabor Mate, for those who've heard of him, I had a conversation with him, and it was really very, very nice to see that there have been studies and that he totally agrees that this relationship with grandparents is so important, even in the modern world. So the economics of happiness, which is the economics of localization, is where we're creating a structure and a path where the more collaborative relationships between the generations not only survive, and not only just for the pleasure of being connected, but it actually are these cultures, traditional and in the new local, you're seeing those relationships being reestablished because of a fundamentally different approach to the economy. And I could say more about that, but I can go on forever, so I'll stop there. And of course, I should just add, obviously, the reconnection to nature is also this profound spiritual and essentially a spiritual home that we're coming back to now with much greater consciousness. What I experienced in Ladakh as well as Bhutan, where I worked over a 5-year period, and in other traditional cultures, was that home in nature was just taken for granted. And yet the worldview of the Buddhist communities that I know so intimately was all the time emphasizing the inextricable interdependence of all life. And people lived in a way where they could see and experience that interdependence. So this is, again, the way forward. Yes.
I just want to jump in briefly before Philipa continues, because there's one story that I know, because we've met 21 years ago or something, that I always really found fascinating. When you were working with then called the International Society for Ecology and Culture in Ladakh, you organized a series of reality tours for Ladakhi grandmothers. Can you tell that story a little bit? Because I think it's really powerful to illustrate what you were talking about.
Yes, well, I mean, we actually ended up organizing reality tours in both directions. But what I discovered in Ladakh, having arrived before really the whole avalanche of modern development came in, with a modern worldview, with modern schooling, modern media, and above all, advertising, Barbie dolls for girls, Rambos with machine guns for boys, polarizing gender roles, which, by the way, I think is a very important issue, because I think we get caught up in the idea that gender is just a social construct. Yes, it was constructed by big money to polarize, but of course there are also biological differences. So I think having the perspective of ancient cultures that really functioned, and where the deep security was so tolerant of difference. And so again, the key about the economics of happiness is that we need to create the psychological fabric where children grow up feeling secure in their identity and being truly recognized as individuals. Paradoxically, this modern consumer culture, which is a global monoculture, markets itself as being about individualism and freedom. It's not. It's about fragmentation and fear, and inducing in our young children the fear that if they don't have the latest iPhone, if they don't have the latest clothes, if they don't have the latest this, they won't be loved, they won't be appreciated. So this dominant system is manipulating a truly universal human need to feel loved, connected, and appreciated, to have meaning, and to be able to contribute also. But it's particularly for children, this sense of being seen, heard, and loved, which is getting twisted into a universal need to consume. So this is the sort of big picture awakening that I had. And what I saw was that the way that this operated was that people had no idea that this consumer culture that was being marketed as so hugely successful wasn't actually what it was cracked up to be in the advertising and media. And so we started organizing reality tours to the West for community leaders, including some mothers and grandmothers who were part of a large women's alliance that I helped to set up in Ladakh, and actually coming to the West and not just seeing that we have problems and that it isn't this paradise that it appears to be. It was more than anything about showing them that they didn't have to feel backward and stupid and inferior, and that they had a lot to teach us, which of course we're now appreciating when we appreciate Indigenous culture, but they weren't getting any of that information. We also organized reality tours when Westerners came out to Ladakh to live in a village and work on a farm. And they were able then to live in an extended family. They were able to get a reality experience that was very rewarding. I have to say that now that's no longer possible, because in Ladakh, as in so many parts of the world, that fabric is breaking down. I don't think that that makes things hopeless, because even in Ladakh now, there are young people who are working hard to raise awareness, and there's real motivation to change things and to respect the traditional culture more. But we need a rapid wake up, particularly in the West, to bring about the changes we need.
I was going to bring us back to that crisis of connection that that you spoke about, which is actually a theme that's been running, I think, through this this series, and also through the webinar, the podcast as well. And in fact, Giles Hutchins in our last event called it a crisis of love. So it's clearly something that we've been all been exploring from different angles, I think, for a while now. But I wanted to ask specifically about how we can best address that crisis in place, because I think this is a theme that resonates in both your work and Daniel's work, that to build these vital life-giving connections, it needs to be done in a locality, in place, rather than at a wide scale.
Because above all, what it needs is ongoing relationships. These are not relationships that have to imprison you for your lifetime. We're not talking about more localized economies and cultures being some kind of prison. We are talking about creating a fabric of smaller businesses, more accountable businesses, the connection between the farmers and the consumers, even the connection between those who are investing in that local economy and the people who are benefiting from it, the people who don't benefit from it. It's all about more accountable, visible, ongoing relationships and structures. Now, what has happened with modernity is that the techno-economic pressures have been fragmenting our societies. First of all, it started with enclosures and then slavery, driving us away from the land into cities. And we haven't looked carefully enough, particularly not the modern, I mean, when I say the recent environmental movement is not looking enough at the cost of urbanization. There were many sociologists and Lewis Mumford, many people who actually recognized how destructive it was earlier on in the 40s and so on, but we've sort of forgotten that. But actually, economic policy is still locked into promoting even further mega urbanization. Right now on this planet, we have not anymore half of the global population, but I would estimate about 40% are still not pushed into giant mega cities. And so another issue that we should be considering is a much more global understanding of what's going on and what are the real threats. Because if we allow that urbanization to continue, we're going to be talking about massively more resource use, pollution, and violence and conflict. So awareness about that link between a globalizing economy where giant banks, financial casino, basically working with giant corporations, blindly are pushing in this direction. In the urban centers, it is, when you think about it, it's unbelievable that we are crowded on top of each other and we suddenly don't look each other in the eye, we don't say hello, we don't know each other's names. Whereas in the smaller communities and even smaller cities, where there are ongoing relationships, people know a larger number of people, they depend on people they know. And it's also particularly important that the family, but the extended family and the close sort of community group has these ongoing relationships. It's particularly important for children, but also for the elderly. And I often talk about the fact that the modern consumer culture is essentially a teenage boy culture. It's one that just wants to go out and ride that speedy car or motorbike, and not too much sense of connection or a nurturing spirit. But when you look at the benefits of these deeper connections, and when you see it, I've experienced it deeply, particularly in Ladakh, but also in Spain, where my husband and I lived in the 80s. And even in the 80s in Spain, there was so much more of that connected fabric. And that included that people would sing together, the youngest and the oldest, singing songs that they all knew, making music. By the way, that's another really important lesson from more traditional cultures, is how enjoyable and spiritually and psychologically healing it is to do singing and music together. not in order to show off and be a star, but for just the sense of joy and connection that it brings, which is, by the way, why most religions did include chanting and singing as part of the traditional practices.
Everything that you're speaking about with this kind of erosion of social cohesion and healthy societies ultimately puts communities in place into a less capable position to meet the catastrophes that are likely to visit us in the next 10, 20, 30 years, because the effects of the system, the erosive system that you're naming, over the last 40 years, over the time that you've been active trying to raise awareness of this, just when that period started, limits to growth and the Jonas Salk's work on Epoch B were clearly naming that if we don't change our pattern in the 1990s, there will be consequences that will be catastrophic starting in the 2030s into the 2050s. Mm-hmm. We've known each other for 20 years. For 20 years ago, one had to be on a soapbox and say, don't you see we're running in the wrong direction? In order to get a few people to understand that maybe localization is not an ideology, but it is actually the pattern by which life fits into life as a planetary process. And therefore, as a species that is alive, we need to relearn that pattern of regeneration, of being part of place, in order to fit humanity back into the situation. What I'm wondering is, are we now at a point where people are paying attention to localization, because it is actually the only way we could possibly weather what is now very likely coming at us? The entire global structure, that story that they're still trying to sell us, the techno future a la Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, let's just have big data analyze soil data and satellite data and do industrial regenerative agriculture with robots, all this madness. Isn't that running against the wall anyway? And what we now need to do is what E.F. Schumacher suggested: we may not be able to raise the winds, but we can set sail, so when the wind comes, we're ready.
Well, exactly. I do think that what we can do rapidly is to build the lifeboats. And so that's a bit setting the sails. And I think that is happening. I think there's definitely a wake up going on. However, like with everything, the giant casino with giant businesses are now marketing themselves as going from globalization to localization. But they're now coming back saying, okay, we're not going to be producing in China and India, and we're going to start producing back home. Now we're going to do it with robots. And I think they are going to be hitting a wall, because when they all shifted over to the other side of the world, and I was part of setting up a forum on globalization, and we studied the impact of the trade treaties that were giving the corporations the freedom to move in and out of every economy and society. And by the way, these trade treaties were set up at the same time as the World Bank and the IMF. And out of good intention for many people believe that in order to prevent another world war and in order to prevent another depression, we must integrate all economic activity. Now, what that meant, the integration meant allowing giant corporations to have the freedom to go in and out of every economy. And what they were doing everywhere then was systematically destroying the local, the regional, and even the national. So all the time now we had this rolling out the red carpet for the big. When they started going off and producing in China and India, and there were labor unions in America or in Europe complaining, they were told, that's just selfish. We're going to be raising the living standard over there. You know, you're privileged Westerners, just be quiet. Now, as they're coming back and they're going to be producing with robots instead of employing people, I think we're going to have much more visibility and accountability. Going over to China and India, they didn't actually raise the living standard for the majority. What they've done is to create a very greedy consumer class that's consuming more and in a more greedy and horrific way than we are in the West. So by the way, don't buy into the rich country, poor country narrative. That's not what it's about. It's about a few rich global corporations, and I hope you've heard that BlackRock and Vanguard in effect own almost everything. It seems unbelievable, but the concentration of wealth has been so great. And as I say, often through well-intentioned blind leaders. Not always, I'm sure there's been a lot of greed as well. But anyway, yes, I think they will be hitting the wall, but I don't think we should be waiting for that. I think if we're aware of what a dead end this is, and if we're aware of the enormous gains of rebuilding the local fabric, if you can just visit the supermarket, compare going to the supermarket with going to the farmer's market, and just think about that. We in the film, The Economics of Happiness, we talk about studies that show that in the farmers market, people have 10 times more conversations with each other than they do in the supermarket. The whole supermarket atmosphere, you come rushing in. I've helped to start farmers markets here and in many parts of the world. And I feel so grateful that I had those insights and that I helped to get these things going, because particularly around local food systems, we have so many examples of the amazing healing that comes with that. Remember that when people engage in growing food, it's an ongoing process, a bit different from planting some trees, which is also wonderful, but it's around the food economy that you start both a deeper ongoing relationship with nature and also a deeper ongoing relationship with others. Of course, not always if you're just doing your own garden, but it's the local food systems that are so important. And you literally have a situation where the farmer earns more, and I mean a lot more. In the supermarket, they will get something like 10% of what you pay if they're lucky. In the farmer's market, 80 to 100%. And it's the most important thing of all, really, when we're talking about survival and biodiversity, is that the local market demands diversity. The farmer's market, whether even in the big city or wherever it is, it doesn't want a ton of straight carrots. You're going to do better if you diversify. In the dominant system, which is separating farmers and consumers further and further, the pressure from 40 years has been towards monoculture. One thing, and not only one thing, but it should ideally be the same size. It's got to fit the machinery for harvesting, the machinery for washing, the machinery for the supermarket shelves. So it's deadly. It's deadly. Monoculture is deadly. Life is this amazing dance of ever diverse, unique moments. Every cell in every leaf, every cell in our body, alive and changing. And please, please help to guard against this romanticization now of robots and this idea that we're going to fuse humans and technology.
I was going to bring that back to something that struck me in the film, actually, in the Economics of Happiness and also Planet Local, which is your latest film, which is around that false narrative of scarcity. And as you say, when there is so much work that needs to be done, that has to be done within the real economy, nature's economy, we've created this false narrative that there aren't enough jobs, etc., out there for everyone to do. There's not a role for everyone out there. So I wondered if you could speak to that in the context of what you've just been saying.
Yes, well, thank you. It's such an important issue that it's maddening when you have the opportunity to step out of industrial society and to see that in a healthy, basic traditional economy, there was no unemployment, never existed. And then to see the creation of scarcity as people are driven away from the land, away from the skills, away from the knowledge about the specific plants, the waterways, the soil, the animals. And ultimately, that is what provides us with everything we need, is the earth. And that knowledge about those specifics and that particular climate and what you can do in June, but what you can't do in February, all of that knowledge of place. And today, more than anything, you know, if I were ambassador, or not ambassador, say if I were emperor of the world, the first thing I would do would be to liberate the human race, to be free to do what we need to do, to heal our waters, our ecosystems, ourselves, and to do the work that is so badly needed. We need more teachers for every student. We need more doctors for every patient. We need more people building houses and knowing how to do it. And what's happening is that we are being made too expensive for ourselves. All of this is a political choice that blindly has been made for us all the time with the propaganda that using more technology, more energy is needed to grow the economy. Growing the economy for the last 40 years has meant that the average middle-class person in the industrialized world has been made poorer and poorer. It's been documented by respected economists, but very hard to get it out there. But serious research looking at how even as women had entered the workplace, they had to now, both husband and wife, work longer hours just to pay the rent, just to pay the mortgage, just to put food on the table, education, childcare, transport, what had become basic needs within an urban industrial economy. People are actually running faster and faster and more fearful of being able to just, you know, hoping that children might be able to buy a house, hoping that they might be able to save a little bit of money. We are not where we are today because most people don't want to let go because they're so greedy. They just want to hang on to everything. We're in this situation because people have not been allowed to know that it's a political choice whether we support giant corporations or support a multitude of smaller, medium-sized, and even larger businesses where necessary. And larger businesses could certainly collaborate internationally. This is not about saying that everything's going to be produced at the village level, but it's about understanding the politics of this globalizing economy. And I'm going on about it because I think that if people understood it better, they'd be much more motivated to right now join the localization movement, the regeneration movement, you know, all the movements that are trying to heal ecosystems and society, to support that as soon as possible. Ideally, we also want people to practice what I call big picture activism. The big picture is that we can say to the climate activists, to the social activists concerned about inequality, those concerned about, you know, every issue virtually under the sun, that they could link hands to demand economic change. I still have the hope that there might be a wake up and this coming together of movements that have been encouraged to see themselves as single issue, that have been encouraged to think that dealing with climate and helping people is a separate thing. And this is going on even though we're all talking about how we are inseparable with life. Well, you know, if we know that human and ecological well-being are linked, that our health is linked to ecosystems, etc., we shouldn't have this fragmented view. And above all, if we understood how the centralizing, globalizing economy has been supported by both left and right, and even green. The Greens have not been able to frame things with the sort of big picture that we need.
Helena, you mentioned Lewis Mumford earlier when you talked about the warning about the urbanization problem. It made me think, because right next to you on my screen is John Ennis, who's working with wonderful local projects in Scotland around local fiber economies, like you just posted Scotland the Bread, which is also a wonderful organization that is looking at Scotland creating its own flour base again to provide its own people with local breads. You're just saying that these movements need to come together. And I know that you're working on a wonderful event in September this year called Planet Local. You mentioning Mumford and seeing John made me think of Patrick Geddes more than 100 years ago, a biologist, basically talking about what we're talking about here, as a biologist who coined the famous phrase, "by leaves we live." That we are fundamentally dependent on the primary productivity of planet Earth, of life creating conditions conducive to life. He also is accredited for coining the term think global, act local. And for me, your voice has been so important over the last 20 years, because very often people go, when they see the globalizing juggernaut of industrial growth society running against the wall and feel disempowered to do anything against that, they then swing to the ultra local, say, let's start an eco-village, let's do what we can here, and almost try to ignore what's going out there. And you made life not very easy for yourself, because every time you were invited to these settings of local greenies wanting to live the good life in their own little region, you kind of shook their cage a little bit, and said, look, we need to do both. We need to keep analyzing what this structural violence is doing to people and planet. And we need to, the only way we can act, which is where you align with Geddes, is at the local scale. Can you talk a bit about this conference and how you see this confluence of movements that is basically preparing us for a much more local planet again?
Yes, so yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'm so bad about promoting what we do and so on, but yeah, very important for us is that we're planning a live face-to-face event in Bristol in the UK in September, the end of September, 1st of October. We may end up having a whole week of events in Bristol, but certainly there'll be 3 or 4 days. And we have an amazing group of speakers coming, including Daniel and people, Lila June and Pat McKay, you might have heard of Charles Eisenstein, Bayo Akomolafe, a lot of people who worked with us for years on this. And it'll be a whole spectrum of people, because we will be hearing from people who are very well informed about the dominant narrative and about how, for instance, the corporations have captured all of us in terms of the description of the cause of climate change and what we should be doing to deal with it. So Camila Moreno is a close colleague of ours from Brazil. She's been at all the summits for the last 11 years and has seen how it's business framing everything and reducing climate to this carbon issue that can be nicely traded and be profitable for big business. It's very, very sad, and it's sad that so few people know about that. But that's not the main theme. The main theme is this amazing celebration of the worldwide localization movement. And we'll be having people from every continent. We can't afford to bring lots and lots, but they're representing work that's going on every continent. And it will be overall the big picture that we're hoping to share in Bristol, and that I also hope to share today, is that when we do look at the big picture, and we've really seen that this globalizing path has all kinds of characteristics, I was saying, the urbanization, the competition, the speed, the total lack of democracy, et cetera, and the monoculture is fundamental too. And we see the need for a systemic path in the opposite direction. Then we need to have a clarity about the sort of paradigm shift we're talking about, the sort of lenses that we need to use. When we do use the global to local lenses, we'll be amazed at how much we see that will give us faith in humanity, that will waken us up to the fact that the dominant narrative says that this is because we're greedy by nature and because we're so selfish, we don't want to let go of things. We'll see all kinds of evidence of how much better things work, how there can be collaboration, and how it's happening. It's growing. It's all the time also being squashed by the dominant system. But in many ways, it inspires me even more when I look at how much has been accomplished without any help from above, with almost no help from government, from dominant media, that these smaller grassroots demonstrations of localization in action are so inspiring. And I can guarantee that wherever you are, I'm not sure how broad the geographic reach is here now with this group, but wherever you are, if you start looking, you will see examples of what we're talking about, and examples that you can join, that you can support, or examples that you can emulate. So if, you know, I've spoken to prisoners, for instance, who were helped to learn to garden, and very importantly also to be in community, to actually relate to each other in a different way. And I've heard hardened criminals, you know, who their whole life had only known, you know, had become angry and hardened, and who within a matter of months with projects like this have been transformed, and who will say, so, you know, it just brings tears to your eyes every time you see it. And actually in Bristol, among others, we'll be working with someone named Mohammed Foods, who is chaplain of the prison there. And he has understood, he became Muslim when he was an ornithologist in, I think it was in Saudi Arabia when he was young, and he's trying to bring nature into Islam. And as the head chaplain of the prison in Bristol, he's brought in greenhouses and chickens and so on for the prisoners to care for. Now, these things sound very small, but I've seen not only, you know, the transformation of people in such a real way and all around the world, but also the transformation of ecosystems. And there are just enough people to care for a little bit of land that was just, you know, barren nothing. In 3 years, you can see just amazing results. And we have evidence of this all over from all over the world. Maybe also just mention to you, you know, one of the biggest examples of this is a so-called eco-village in Seoul in South Korea. And I first discovered it probably about 8 years ago. It just happens my book in South Korea was a bestseller, and I'm like really famous there. And I got, yeah, sort of, I have never actually spent a lot of time there, but whenever I go, I'm approached by a lot of different projects. So I go and visit this project called Sumisan, and it's a beautiful example of what we're talking about. On the edge of this soulless city, high-rise city that was pushed by America and the corporate world to push people off the land, out of smaller towns, to become a high-tech factory for the global economy. There, on the edges of that city, there was still a bit of a hill with a few trees. When it was going to get developed, the people around it came together. Coming together, changing the I to a we is such a big part of it. And they came together to protect that and to see off the development. And that grew into them starting an alternative school, starting a community center, starting a community library. And then when I visited, there were 20,000 people that were connected to this. And it was so interesting that the line between who is part of Sumisan and who isn't was this jagged line. Some businesses, some homes belong to it. But of course, what they belong to is something where their own voice, their own initiative, their own vision had real meaning compared to being in the bigger system. So I hope that makes sense.
I think it's probably, Philipa, what do you think? It's time to go over to questions, but just before we do that, and now I've lost my thread. I wanted to ask one more question. anyway, I think there's so many really fascinating people on this call. I'm a bit concerned that we're really talking in echo chambers here because I know too many people on this call. But I would love to bring in some of the people here just in terms of naming some of them that I know of. John Ennis, I've already mentioned with his work in Scotland. Anna Pollock is here, who's working with regenerative tourism in many ways. I'm not going to mention all of Neil and Anna, who and Anne from Belgium calling in, really working with the question of, are we doing enough to face the impeding cascading collapses of the system that actually needs to collapse for life to re-flourish? But now I know the question that I wanted to ask you. You've been very polite. Like Helena and I were actually on a call yesterday, and we had a very passionate conversation about the shadow side or possible shadow side of the regeneration meme. And of course, I could get very triggered by that because I'm quite invested in that term being aligned with life's regenerative pattern, being an ancient returning into the way that life creates conditions conducive to life, picking up the wisdom of indigenous people that we called primitive cultures at exactly the moment where we started to build this monstrous planet-consuming, life-denying system. Helena, I actually would like to invite you to speak to your concern about how regeneration, as you said, might have even been planted as a meme. I'm not sure if that's the case, but there is definitely now a corporate takeover, just as there has been with sustainability, of that term regeneration. And suddenly people are selling a globalized, locally active through robots and technology with AI and satellite data type future that is still selling the high-tech utopia that we now know is simply not possible. And if we continue on that path, we waste important resources and energy and important human capital to prepare a much healthier system to meet the effects of what we've sown. So yeah, could you please, before we pass over, I think it will energize the discussion, say a bit about the critique on regeneration that you voiced yesterday.
Yeah, well, I was particularly concerned when suddenly, very suddenly, regenerative agriculture was on the map. And I saw that there's quite a lot of money behind it and the films. And I knew that for big business, local food systems are absolutely the biggest threat. And they simultaneously, we're seeing lots of studies and films saying that, oh, don't think that the emissions from global trade in food are significant. As it turns out, the global trade in food is the biggest contributor to climate change. And you need to know that in the climate negotiations, no mention of trade. The emissions from trade are not included. And I'm very disappointed that people like Paul Hawken don't talk about this. They just talk about how we need more efficient planes and boats. It's an insanity what's happening with global trade. And we're talking about importing and exporting the same product, beef, veal, water, milk, butter. And that's going on while we talk about climate change. And no one, I mean, I sometimes can get pretty angry because I've spoken to the head of Greenpeace in the US, UK, and Australia about it, and they don't take it up. But I know they have funding and maybe they believe the propaganda that is not significant, but it's just so. But at least people should be saying, what? There's no measure of those emissions. They're not even calculated. They don't count. Why? Who's in charge? So it's very worrying about the degree of influence of these global corporations. And I think it's really important that we look at this in a clear way without demonizing any particular individuals, any particular corporations, any particular government. It's really been a systemic escalation. It's really clear when you look at it that way. And I'm not trying to exonerate every greedy CEO or anything like that, but still. So what I could see pretty clearly is that the regenerative agriculture has been a very unfortunate way of sort of glossing over and not talking about the real issues. We need to be more holistic in our language. We need to be using more words to describe what we need. If we just use regen, and now even local is problematic, we are often becoming alibis for what's going on already, that Nestle and the giants are talking about, yeah, we're regen. And so we're now having a situation where the monocultures using lots of chemicals are claiming to be doing some carbon stuff with the soil, and that's regen. We have a situation where trees are being bunged up planted by airplanes, literally, and that's the trade-off for net zero. So we've got to be really, really clear that we don't end up wasting time, and we don't end up creating an alibi for that, and we don't help to wake up enough people to really get on with what we can do. And it's smaller, it's about spreading the wealth, and so it won't interest big investors in the same way that it could interest us as investors. That's partly what happens in the localization movement, is that even 20 people putting in $1,000 each, it's amazing what they can do to help rebuild the infrastructure, what they can even do to start a local energy scheme that is genuinely local. But we need to be looking at the grid also, because we're often now being fooled into fueling a grid, and we're being manipulated horribly by big business working with government. So I would say that local is still a little more safe than just regen, because at least if we're talking about local systems, we're talking about more visibility and more accountability. So when the big corporation comes and says, oh, we're local and we've got high-rise agriculture based on AI, it will be visible and it will be much more easily discredited as corporate propaganda. So I would just urge that we all try to use language. We need to be talking about shorter distances. We need to be looking at trying to shorten them, but not become fundamentalist overnight. We've had the problem when we raise it, then people say, oh, Helena, I'm so embarrassed, my meal, it's got some spices from somewhere. And forever and ever we're saying, no, it's about doing what we can, and particularly as a we, starting to create the collaboration between consumer and business. We need to be paying attention to scale. What's very unfortunate, and I'm not quite sure what John is thinking now, but very often the businesses that start off these beautiful examples of more localized ways of doing things are so loved and so successful, and then they get bought up by the giants. We need to be alert as consumers, as activists, as citizens to the very important issue of scale. We need to be alert also to not going too far and too fundamentalist as we try to do things differently. For instance, there's a tendency to think that, oh, a co-op is always going to be better than a private business. That's not true necessarily. Small independent businesses can be very efficient, can be very good, whether it be a small carpentry business, whether it be a restaurant, whether it be a farm, but scale is absolutely fundamental, scale and accountability. So just be aware that regen, to a very great extent, has been funded by and promoted by big business. And just as I was invited by US intelligence to go to their headquarters naval intelligence based in Rhode Island, and they wanted me to come and do a seminar on localization. What is it? And I knew they would know everything we're up to anyway, but I didn't particularly want to go there, but I did it online 7-8 years ago. And it was so clear that they wanted to be sure that I believe, like most of the localists at that time, that 3D printing, the internet, blockchain, that all of that was going to help to decentralize and localize. And you know, they weren't too happy when I kept giving all these arguments why I didn't think that those were tools that were actually helping. Through more direct relationships, we can achieve so much more, but we mustn't be too idealistic, too ideological. We should shy away from believing that everything has to be totally consensual decision-making, that we should have this perfect democracy as we're trying to create structures that can be really helpful for the whole community. Sometimes the initiatives are better. It's just 3 or 4 people and they get on with it. But then again, as I say, the accountability, the visibility, and hopefully the projects we support are not driven by personal blind ambition. They may very well be driven by the need to have a livelihood, which, you know, all people do now. And so again, we just have to be common sense and not too idealistic. Can I give another example? Like when I helped to encourage farmers markets, you know, I remember coming back to some towns and they say, oh yes, Helena, now, you know, we started one and we're only allowing farmers who are less than 50 miles away. And then I would explain that, no, this is about the vision of moving in that direction. You might have a more thriving market if you have biscuits made from wheat that came from 100 miles away. You might be localizing if you're buying it from America or England or France rather than from South America. So again, it's a process, it's a relative term. What is local? So this process of localization, there's no absolute boundaries.
John.
Thanks very much, Daniel. John, and I'm in Palma, but I'm usually in Scotland. Helena, thank you so much for that extraordinary, the words of wisdom. I feel sort of bathed in something very special, and Daniel, for all your erudite links. It was really just to pick up perhaps on a couple of things that you've just been talking about and how we face the bigger problem. And Daniel mentioned the sort of possibly probable implosion of those unworkable systems while we work away in our local community. It's just how to face that. I was reminded of Dwight Eisenhower's post-Second World War commentary about he invented the industrial military complex. But that phrase originally contained industrial military congressional complex. Understood that it was built into the voting system, so many vested interests. Now, with that against us, how do we make a difference? My solution is to get into action locally and actually let the narcissism of social media and the inability for me as a person or even in community to face that massive problem of vested interests. I've had to let that go. My energy can't go to that. It can barely go to talking about it, but I've made it go. What do you think?
Well, I just think, I don't think I've done a particularly good job tonight, but I do believe that there is a way of describing that dominant system and the craziness of it. For instance, in Bristol, we hope to do that with comedians and humor. We hope to laugh it off the stage. And I don't feel that right now my colleagues in the environmental movement are looking enough at, as I say, the central thread whereby through treaties, governments have handed over power to corporations. So I feel by the ignorance around that, we haven't understood how is it that we've got these few billionaires? How is it that the gap between rich and poor is widening in this obscene way that everybody recognizes is wrong? And then when we hear talk about how we're going to deal with it, it's all within a particular government, we're now going to tax the rich. It's nonsense. If you know that governments are signing in black and white to global banks and businesses, we will not do anything that will reduce your profit. So that they're suing countries for wanting to phase out nuclear. There's now America's being sued because they shut off the Keystone pipeline. And there's a basic truth here that I believe could be very helpful to understand how and why, what are the structures. So when I first discovered that, it was such a sense of relief, because before that, I just felt, oh, this system, it's so vast, it's everywhere, it's, you know, all over the world, it's got all these, there's a central thread that has to do with the globalizing part through treaty, through specific agreement. If we can focus on that, I think we could have a clear voice about immediately get back to negotiate new treaties, but that will only happen if we have a movement that is demanding that. It's not going to happen now through one individual parliamentarian or one individual, that we need to have some clarity. So while we get on with the work at the grassroots level, we ideally in every group, or even most of us, if we could devote a little bit of time, maybe 10% of the time, to also informing ourselves and others about the policy solution, which is so much simpler than people think. You would think that if governments were to sit down together, and it could start with what I call a breakaway strategy, a few governments coming together and saying, we cannot continue to sell out our country, to make ourselves poorer vis-a-vis these global corporations, to go with our begging bowl to them while we starve our own people. And, you know, we're talking about literal starvation. Now, we're now going to collaborate to be strong enough to say no to this corporate lobby. It could happen. I know it's, you know, my husband keeps telling me, don't work so hard, don't be so attached. I'm not attached to an outcome of this actually happening. I am attached to the idea that before I die, there will be more of a wake up, so that we'll be looking more at the central threads. There'll be a stronger localization movement, and that's happening. So I can already feel, wow, it's good, you know, it's been worth doing this work. And I haven't done it, you know, totally neglecting myself. So I think working at the local level, also, I feel that if you show our films, hopefully they can help to interest more people in the local area, to build more of that community fabric, to get more things happening. And I do want to urge you to look at food as probably the most effective, central, strategic area to focus on. Just remember that food is something every person needs every day. And we, you know, imprisoned in a system where we separated further and further from the sources of that food. And the waste, the pollution that comes from that, the plastic, the chemicals, you know, it's so building those thriving food systems remarkably is easier than you would imagine if you have enough people supporting it. Part of it will be some investments where local people invest in supporting that in a sort of slow money way, where they don't expect, you know, quick returns on the investment and so on. But yeah, we need to have some more questions.
Helena, it's just such a pleasure to help get you 40 years of work to
45.
more people. 45. And it's just a real honor to have you on the program. Thank you for making the time. The one thing that I wanted to, because we touched on this in a number of ways, that I feel like taking a bit of airtime to highlight and would love your opinion on, is that precisely there is in this kind of how is regen being co-opted, for what you spoke to, there are wonderful people working on techie programming solutions based on crypto, this, that, and the other, to create these supposedly, like it's really well intentioned, it's intention to create a bottom-up system of governance that would, in theory, let everybody vote on everything. But for me, there's an insidiousness to that, which is to say, well, you've created an opinion-making machine through social media, and now you're giving the right to vote on everything to everybody in an economy of attention, where you can play via algorithm what people will vote for, because they don't have time to inform themselves deeply enough to come up with really systemic decisions. And so we're actually, well-intentioned people are creating the machine of our complete enshacklement and a farce of democracy in the name of democracy. I would love you to speak to that.
Well, I totally agree. And also, by the way, the 5-star movement in Italy tried to practice this sort of direct democracy, and it just completely destroyed them, because there are also, all kinds of practical problems with it. And these poor young parliamentarians were completely overwhelmed. And so I think the beauty of really understanding decentralization and starting to connect with more human scale groups, where you have a voice and where you can see the impact of what you do, it's incredibly empowering and rejuvenating. And the wonderful thing about these local cells of people is that they experience a personal healing from it, as well as more meaningful activism and action. But remember, I'm saying also, ideally, they will include the big picture to try. You see, even including the big picture at the local level. I've been holding meetings here with people to try to further the local food movement here. And we have 4 farmers markets. And what I'm up against is people think, oh, no, we already have lots of local food. It was only when we had floods here that more people realized, oh, wait a minute. The supermarket shelves were empty in a matter of days. And there was a time here just this year when it looked like the highway was closed in all directions, and there was a bit of panic. And through all that, the local farmers and and COVID as well, they were able to increase their productivity amazingly, because again, they had goodwill from other growers and other people who were able to help them. And they did that without increasing the prices. It almost makes me cry when I think of it, but it's just that within that context, people tend to behave better. As again, and I want to say that also, to Bristol, that in those structures there is both more accountability, but there is also more motivation to do the right thing. It's a very natural social pressure that is so helpful. Does that make sense? So I completely agree with you about the technology, but it's probably one of the single most important issues right now, is to try to avoid that waste of energy and time that I really don't think is going to go anywhere except in the wrong direction and feed right into the dominant system.
I think we're at time, unfortunately. It's been such a brilliant discussion, and we're so grateful for your time, Helena. Thank you so much today, and to Daniel too. It's always wonderful to have you here guiding our discussions.
And thanks to all of you. It's been lovely to see you all, and hope to stay in touch. Hope to see some of you in Bristol. Some of it will be also streamed. So please do sign in and connect also. Look at our website. If you're interested in localization, you'll get a PhD in localization by going through our materials, because we've been collecting them for years. And so thanks to all. And thanks so much, Daniel. Thank you.